From the Mercy One studio.
Man Up, brought to you by Construction Professionals, a program dedicated to inspiring and helping men live lives of heroic virtue. Join Joe Stopulos every Monday at 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. on Iowa Catholic Radio. And now, it's time to Man Up.
Another year goes by, more beers, more smoke.
And welcome to Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. I am Joe Stopulos. We are broadcasting from the Mercy One studio, heard on 1150 AM, 88.5 FM, and 94.5 FM. Around the globe, streaming on iowacatholicradio.com and heard on iPhones everywhere via the iTunes podcast store. Please like us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter. Again, I am Joe Stopulos, and today I'm excited to be joined by no guest for the first time probably in my 4 years of doing this, flying completely solo, but it's a special show. It's a tribute to my grandfather, and it'll be really a lesson for all of us on what we can learn from our grandfathers and our parents, and what we can do to instill those values in the next generation. Let's start in a word of prayer. Lord, I cannot ask you for more blessings, for I have been duly blessed. Instead, I ask you for the to grant fortune to the less fortunate, comfort where there is pain, peace where there is unrest, and love where there is hate. And if all those things should come to me as well, grant me the grace to receive them with humility and gratitude. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. That prayer was written by my brother Tim, as I messed it up here in the middle, and I thought that was a good time to share it, in the fact that today's episode will be about my grandfather, who taught us so much about the faith, and I know for sure Tim could not have written that without the example that my grandfather had on him and all of our siblings and cousins in regards to our faith. And really excited about this episode. I have in the past talked much about my grandparents and the influence they've had on me, grandmothers and grandfathers. Most notably, the episode we did with Gary Dolphin, we're talking about my grandfather and the example of him and his entire generation, quite frankly, when it came to hard work and just the lessons we could learn from the greatest generation. So go back in the archives and listen to that interview with Gary Dolphin, the voice of the Hawkeyes, one of my favorites of all time. But I thought, as we celebrated All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day last week, and we just buried my grandfather a couple weeks ago now, I thought this would be a really great opportunity to reflect on his life. Not so much from a eulogy for my listeners here, but there are so many great examples of stories and then life lessons that we all can learn from him. He was really an exceptional person. And because of that, I thought I'd share some of those with you. It also, for me, helps a lot to realize that the actions we have in this life have ramifications that we can hardly think of. I know my grandfather probably wasn't thinking when he did all these things that it would make this much of an impact, and maybe did, but the impact that he made on all the people around him. And what does it mean for us? What are we doing in our lives proactively to influence those around us? Most specifically, obviously, our children and our grandchildren, but even those for whom maybe we don't have a familiar relationship. And my grandpa will talk about a story on the next segment about the impact he made on those around him who weren't his children and his grandchildren. And I think all of us have those opportunities, but really I think, for me at least, you got to hit the reset button sometimes and take a step back and say, all right, what am I doing with my children? What am I doing with my grandchildren? What am I doing with my work life to make those impacts? I think it's really a good time to, especially around a funeral, around an obituary, to reflect on your own funeral and your own obituary. So where do I want to be at that point when I die? Who will I want to make an impact on? How will I have lived out the talents that God's given me, the graces He's given me to pass those on to others? What am I doing with those things? The reflection I do fairly regularly in my own life is to think from my obituary back. Try to plan my life back from who do I want at my funeral? What do I want said about me in my obituary? When you think back to that, it really does help you to realize, okay, what am I doing today to make those decisions? I know my grandfather, he lived a life such that he had no one that could talk badly about him at his funeral. I know that. He also made a legacy to many people in his family and outside of his family. So excited to do that in the next segment. Real quick, I've got to plug a few great events we have coming up here. This Friday, Man Up Power Lunch on Friday, November 8th at noon at St. Francis of Assisi. Tim Jameson's going to bring a whole lot of relics, one of them being a first-class relic of the true cross of Christ. So be there at noon on Friday at St. Francis of Assisi. And then Tuesday, November 19th, we will have a Man Up evening event with Bishop William Joensen, and it'll be a mission as men, and it'll be led by Deacon Randy Keel. Rosary starts at 5:20, Mass at 5:45, and the program starts at 6:30 at the Basilica of St. John. So really excited about that. We are going to head to a short break, and when we return, I will be here by myself, but I will be sharing stories that my grandfather and his legacy left behind and what we can learn from them.
Thank you, construction professionals, for underwriting our show, Man Up. Construction professionals have been long supporters of Iowa Catholic Radio, and we've seen their work firsthand. It's very impressive. They do remodeling or new construction that is innovative, functional, and designing what you want. cpcustomhomes.com.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and John Leonetti in the Morning is provided by Five Sons Naturescapes. Five Sons Naturescapes is a Catholic veteran-owned family company providing premium outdoor landscaping. Extend your living space outdoors with patios, pergolas, fencing, and retaining walls. Outdoor lighting is another way to enjoy your landscaping day and night. Five Sons Naturescapes will spend the time to understand your needs and create your perfect outdoor space. Learn more about Five Sons Naturescapes at fivesonsnaturescapes.com. Thank you to Five Sons Naturescapes for their support of Iowa Catholic Radio. Thank you to Golden Rule for their support of Iowa Catholic Radio.
At Golden Rule Plumbing, Heating, and Cooling, we do our best to serve the people and communities who so generously support us. We try and find some way to give back every single month because we know everyone can use some help. Golden Rule is very thankful for all of our customers and your continued support of us. We would like to wish you and yours a very blessed holiday season. I'm Bobby from Golden Rule, where we deliver respect, understanding, loyalty, expertise, and service every time you call. We have a standard and we prove it with every job. Online at goldenrulephc.com.
My help comes from you. You're right here pulling through.
And welcome back to Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. As I mentioned in the first segment, I will be having reflections on my grandfather. Actually, I'm going to start with my great-grandfather and the lessons we can learn from them as men, as parents, as grandparents living today. So I'll start you back way a long time ago. My great-grandfather, Alfred Liebscher, he was born and raised in Germany, and I know a lot of this because we have an audio tape of him in his probably 70s at this point, 1960s. He was one of the pioneers of New Braunfels, Texas, and so we actually have an audio recording, two hours of radio. I actually just listened to it a couple weeks ago. And Alfred left Germany at age 18 to go to Chicago. So he told his mother, I'm heading to Chicago. I think there's a good life for me in America. And English, obviously, at this point is a second language. So one of the first lessons I've learned from my great-grandfather is fortitude and courage. I mean, the ability to make that decision. I think about where I was at in my life at age 18, and I know I would never have moved to Germany and tried to pick up my life and communicate with my mother and father via letter a couple times. It's mind-blowing to think that you could make that decision at age 18 to pick up your life and move to Chicago. Well, sure enough, he did that. And literally 6 months later, after he left Germany, World War I broke out. So timing worked out okay for him to do that. And moved to Chicago and worked his way up there for about 4 years. And then finally, one of the buyers where he was working, said, hey, I need a good person down in Texas. I would love to hire you. Would you be willing to move to Texas? Have an opportunity at ownership in this company. And there was a German community in New Braunfels, and he obviously felt they needed someone who could speak German for them. So it worked out well. So he heads down to New Braunfels, and there he ends up marrying his boss's daughter, who was my great-grandmother, who was actually discerning into the convent at the time, which is an interesting story in itself. And anyway, he ends up running the flour mill in New Braunfels. One of the lessons we've learned so much from him via my grandfather is his living of the Catholic social teaching in his life. So my great-grandfather founded the hospital. He was one of the original founders of the hospital. We realized we needed to take care of the poor people, take care of everyone specifically, but he had this huge heart for the poor and constantly he had lines of people at his house who he would give food to, almost like food pantry. They ran out of their house almost, understanding that he was in a place of privilege to be able to do this. So he had this tremendous care for the poor. So just right off the bat, from my great-grandfather, the virtues of courage, of fortitude, of having that heart for the poor and working hard. He founded the Lions Club. He saw where opportunities were needed for people to get together, and he acted upon those. So that was the house that my grandfather, Karl Liebscher, grew up in New Braunfels, a very Catholic house. Strong German heritage. Obviously, my grandfather speaking German, my great-grandfather speaking German. My grandfather picked it up and spoke fluently all through the rest of his life. And so he grew up Catholic, very Catholic upbringing in New Braunfels, Texas, and ended up going to school north. Went to Notre Dame University in South Bend, Indiana, which is where he met my grandmother. So here is the first date story of them getting together. I think there's a great takeaway for us here. He is set up by both of my great-grandmothers with my grandmother at Notre Dame. She is from Iowa. He is from Texas. They meet, and he sets a curfew on the date because he has to go home and listen to Bishop Sheen on the radio show and his Life is Worth Living broadcast. So here's a man who, in the first date with his future wife, cuts it off shortly because he wanted to go home and listen to a Catholic bishop talk about God. I just think that shows his level of priorities, understanding that God is indeed first. Putting God first in all of our relationships is the most important thing we can do. Also, great plug for Catholic radio. It's very important to listen to Catholic radio, people. Listen, my grandfather ended his first date early with my grandmother, and obviously everything worked out. Well, from there, he does end up marrying my grandmother, and I'll never forget this quote, and he told us this regularly, and this is advice I give to young men as well. He said, the best decision I ever made in my entire life was marrying your grandmother. And he just talked about how marrying a strong Christian woman, and then the virtues that she possessed. She was smart, she was patient, she had musical talent, which he lacked, and so that was an investment by him to be able to pass on some level of musical proficiency, I believe, through the rest of his lineage. Anyway, all of that was passed on to the subsequent generations of his family. And I remember him reflecting upon, later on in life, this is in the most recent years actually, just the magnitude of the decision to marry a strong Catholic woman and what that did, not just for his children, but for his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren. Being able to see that those virtues were passed on, these virtues that he married this woman for were passed on. So the importance in marriage of choosing a good spouse. I think it's something that we need to be teaching our children and our grandchildren about, is that this decision you're making is one that has importance for generations on. So the best decision I ever made in my life was marrying your grandmother. Well, he settled in Davenport, Iowa. Actually, he tried to get her to move to New Braunfels. She made it 3 months. The temperature never got below 100, except for one day. The high got below 100, and she looked at him and said, "This is not going to happen." So they headed back up to Davenport. They have 8 children, and one of the great lines from a Liebscher wedding was when my grandpa Karl and his wife Mary Agnes, when God said to be fertile and multiply, he took them seriously. So 8 children. He was a banker, and really he was a man of teaching. He was a teacher, not by trade, but he just lived it in life. That was his vocation, was to teach people. Whether you wanted to be taught or not, he was going to teach you something. A lesson he learned in Father Hesburg's marriage class back at the University of Notre Dame was that it's easier to exemplify values than to teach them. And he did this in spades throughout his life. So the first thing I would point out that we learned, we being all of his children and grandchildren, learned from him was patience. One of the quotes he said so often was he was told by, I believe, either his wife or his mother, that upon yelling at a child who was being disobedient, quote was, "You will lose those kids if you keep talking to them and treating them that way." And from that moment, he really decided that while his children were young, that he needed to model his fatherhood after God the Father through patience and forgiveness. And this is something he never let go of. And that is our call. Men, we have to model God the Father to our wife and to our children and to our grandchildren. And I've never met anyone who's done this better than my Grandpa Carl. And one of the ways that showed itself is that instead of spanking and yelling, which is what I believe, honestly, I know I am just geared to that. I feel like I am fairly common in that that is the first inclination, but taking a step back, waiting for that to go to subside, and being thoughtful in how we discipline our children. Discipline is the key word there. By instruction, he would oftentimes sit them down, and they call them stairwell chats. Sit his children down when they were disciplining them, and just talk to them, and talk to them, and talk to them, to the point where you would rather just gotten spanked and gotten it over with, rather than being lectured to about how you've disappointed your father or your grandfather. That's something I think about quite regularly with my children, taking a step back from those natural inclinations to spank or to yell or whatever it is, and have those and try to exemplify the patience that God the Father would show us. Another thing he modeled was friendship. He was very lucky that he ended up having a neighbor who was a very dear friend, and they lived next door to each other for over 50 years. In retirement, they had coffee every single day together at 10 a.m. and shared life together. They talked about the good, the true, and the beautiful. Both men were brilliant of mind and were lifelong learners. And they didn't. So this is one of the things we talk about on the show, is that friendship is very important, but you want to have friendships that are rooted in something that's deeper. They didn't just talk about sports and the news, but they talked about family and politics, science, art, philosophy, theology, and the like. They talked about things of consequence, of meaning, and pushed each other in learning more about the good, the true, and the beautiful. I think that's where we need to root our friendships in. I mean, how lucky he was to have someone next door to him. But what are we doing to surround ourselves with men like that, with Christian friendships like that, where we're pushing ourselves and growing with others in virtue? And I look at that example of friendship, and I want that in my own life. I want to be able to have that in my life. He was blessed to have it literally next door to him, but I think that's something that we all need to be doing to model great friendship that is based in rich discussion, not just sports and news, which is so often what we see today. One of the stories I have to share is at his wake a couple weeks ago now. As it is with most 90-year-olds, mostly his family and friends gathered together. But shortly after I arrived, there was someone grieving at the casket who I had recognized from years ago, and his name is Terry. Terry was a young African-American when he approached my grandfather about age 14 for some work. And my grandfather said, "Yeah, I'm happy to help you." Well, Terry's life, he didn't really have a father figure, and Terry ended up in jail for short stints here and there. My grandfather visited him constantly and had him visit my grandfather constantly. They ended up having a friendship, so much so that at my grandfather's wake, there crying next to the casket was Terry. And I talked to Terry. He said, "That is my best friend." Terry saw my grandfather as a father to him. And it made me think, obviously, my grandfather invested heavily into Terry and supported him, not just monetarily, but also emotionally. It's very reminiscent of the wake and the funeral of Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati in Italy, when the poor and the destitute and the people who needed him, that he served throughout his life, those were the people at his funeral. Even though he was in a position of power, those are the people who were adorning him at his funeral. And I wondered, I saw Terry at my grandfather's funeral. I thought to myself, who do I have that's going to be at my funeral? Will there be people that I've served? I sure hope so. But are we cultivating relationships with people who need us, people who may be on the margins? And obviously my grandfather did that, and that was such a great example for me to see that. He always put God first. He went to daily mass. I think another example for me to see, if I ever showed up at noon at St. Anthony's in Davenport, he would be there. He delivered a sermon every Christmas. So we had at Christmas, we had the regular sermon the priest would give, and then we had a second sermon that my grandfather would give. So the quote that is attributed to St. Francis of Assisi of preach the gospel always, when necessary, use words. Well, he always preached the gospel, and he quite often found it necessary to use words. which was great because he had a way with words, but he would often talk to us about what are we doing to live the Christmas spirit throughout the year. Who are we serving? Who is at need of Christ's love in the world? And again, when you see your grandfather, a man of such strength, living an authentically Catholic life, Christian life, it's bound to rub off on his children and his grandchildren. Another great quote of his was, if the children were talking bad to his mother, he would say, "I do not care how you talk to your mother, but don't you ever talk to my wife that way." He loved his wife, and he served her every day of his life. And again, he had that love of God the Father for his wife. He was also a lifelong learner. He tried new things. I think this is a great story for me, is that he didn't pick up skiing until he was 40. I remember him skiing my entire life. He didn't pick it up until he was 40. So he's always willing to try new things. And this is a guy who loved pickled herring, which I think is absolutely disgusting, but he wouldn't eat broccoli. But somehow in his late 70s, he picked up eating broccoli. So he was never afraid of new things. And lastly, I'll share one more thing before I head to break. I think this is really the culmination of a life well lived, is that at his bedside, the days before he died, he was in the house that he lived in since the 1950s, surrounded by his children, his mother, and his grandchildren. And for days on end, we were there at vigil, just holding his hand and being with him. And I can just think of no better way to go out than surrounded by the people you've spent your entire life ministering to. I think a reflection for all of us is to think, where do we want to be? What legacy do we want to leave when we are at our deathbed? And I think my grandfather did a really good job of really cultivating a great life that ended with such a great way to go out, surrounded by family and friends. We're going to head to a short break, and I've got a few more reflections on the other side, so stick around, and we'll be right back.
Why do folks give to the Catholic Tuition Organization? Probably because they love Catholic schools, right? Well, partially, but they also like the tax benefits, or they were helped when their kids were in school, or they have been blessed and want to bless others. Whatever the reason, the 65% tax credits are great, and after all, it's for the kids and their future. Online, ctoiowa.org.
Thank you to Confluence Brewing Company for your support of Iowa Catholic Radio. Confluence Brewing Company, brewed locally and featuring regular, seasonal, and limited release beers available in their tap room and at local stores, bars, and restaurants. Confluence has a beer garden for you, your family, and friends to enjoy. Confluence Brewing Company is located at 1235 Thomas Beck Road off the bike trail south of Grays Lake and online at confluencebrewing.com. Confluence Brewing Company, where good things come together, ingredients, ideas, and friends. Iowa Catholic Radio welcomes At Evening with Father Ricardo, sponsored by Ut Feedom, December 7th, 7 p.m. in the Grand Ballroom at the Iowa Event Center. Learn more at iowacatholicradio.com. Ut Feedom, Latin for Keep the Faith, strives to develop Dowling Catholic High School students who will keep the faith through college. Ut Feedom does this by supporting students in forming deep personal relationships with Christ through small group ministry and faith mentoring. Learn more about An Evening with Father John Ricardo, sponsored by Ut Feedom, Saturday, December 7th at iowacatholicradio.com.
My help comes from you. You're right here.
And welcome back to Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. As I mentioned, I could talk about my grandfather for hours. Unfortunately, this radio show is 30 minutes. So I'll wrap up a few final thoughts I had on the conversation on my grandfather and lessons we can learn from him. It is interesting. The man was a lover of music and a lover of sports, though he was not a musician and not an athlete by any sense of the word, but he appreciated music. So he couldn't play piano, but man, he could appreciate music and loved to hear it. And same thing with sport. He wasn't much of an athlete at all, but man, did he appreciate the work and the excellence that athletes achieved. And that's something that passed down from generation to generation. My brother Pete wrote a mini eulogy, I guess, and he ended up sharing it at the burial. And I want to share a little piece from it. My grandfather spent much of his adult retirement studying science and really trying to discover and to understand gravity and how gravity, so stuff way beyond my pay grade, but he loved science. And this is from my brother, through his passion for science and his intellectual pursuits surrounding the structure of the universe, I think Argopa, my grandpa, achieved a greater perspective on his humanity. His perspective afforded him a humility and peace that we should all strive to achieve. He expressed this humility through the treatment of his fellow man. It is said that when one studies the vastness of the universe, they unlock an understanding of their insignificance in the grand scheme of life. That understanding can result in a choice to live one of two ways: with an indifference due to the very brief existence of our life on a spinning rock in the middle of a vast universe, or for an eternal gratitude for the opportunity to exist among our fellow humans. And my grandfather chose the latter. It's been a joy for me to be able to spend this time with you today, talking about my grandfather, talking about the examples he gives, and I just, as I think about what I'm going to teach to my children from his life, it's patience, it's love of family, it's love of God, it's generosity to others, it's living out the Catholic social teaching, and it's putting God first. He always said that heaven is the reward, and so at his funeral, we very much were very much understanding that he had achieved his reward, and that's what he'd worked for his whole life. So we always saw him as a leader of the band. As the Dan Fogelberg song said, he was the leader of the band, and we are just trying our best to imitate the leader of the band.
The leader of the band is tired and his eyes are growing old, but his blood runs through my instrument and his song is in my soul. My life has been a poor attempt to imitate the man. I'm just a living legacy to the leader of the band. I am a living legacy to the leader of the band.
Man Up, inspiring men to live out their call to holiness with Joe Stopulos. Heard Mondays at 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. on Iowa Catholic Radio. Brought to you by Construction Professionals.